Hi! In this video, I am going to give you some tips and advice on how to get started with solo role-playing games. And I am also going to talk about some general thoughts concerning the finer points of Abraham's method. You obtain some results there that I think are connected to some real-life players' attitudes and intentions in role-playing games. For those of you that do not know about Abraham's method, well, all of the links are going to be in the description below, but it's basically a method where you play as a solo game master with emulated player characters. This video resulted as a sort of... I was inspired to do it because of two comments by two of my viewers. One comment from a couple of months back made by Entropino. Entropino basically said that he noticed that in Abraham's method, sometimes the decisions and the actions of the emulated player characters, they sometimes feel a bit schizophrenic. And I think that's a perfect point to talk about or to connect to some real situations that you would see in multiplayer tabletop RPG. And the other comment is made by, it's more recent, I saw it today, by Juliet, another viewer. Juliet commented that it's the first time or the first experience that Juliet is having concerning playing a role-playing game as a solo experience. Juliet has been playing some solo board games, but she's just tinkering or playing around with the idea of getting fully into solo role-playing games, either as a solo game master with emulated player characters using Abraham's method, or playing as a player character with a game master emulator such as Mythic. So in this video I am going to give some tips and advice on that, on how to get started, while talking about other finer points concerning Abraham's method. So it's important to consider if you have previous or even extensive experience playing role-playing games in other forms of entertainment, like for example video games, of course, or those choose your path or choose your own way sort of books like Lone Wolf, Fighting Fantasy, because that establishes a firm base. In the case of Juliet, I think this is Juliet's first experience in general. Juliet has not participated in a group of experienced role players playing any sort of RPG, Call of Cthulhu, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. So in that case, I would highly recommend that you first start playing one of those solo specific or solo specialized role playing games. If you like the occult or paranormal things, you could start with Seekers Beyond the Shroud. I am also going to put links to my reviews of those games in the description. You could also try Scarlet Heroes, of course. Juliet also mentioned that Scarlet Heroes look like a fine choice to begin. You could also try Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls. And I want to remind everyone that Flying Buffalo is somewhat in a shaky situation right now. It is being purchased by another group, so I don't know if all of the modules and books are going to be available at Drive-Thru RPG. It could be a good idea to get them while they are still available there. So yes, I would recommend that you start with a solo-specific role-playing game. It's definitely an advantage, in the case of Juliet, that when you have experience with a solo board game, because there are many solo board games that get pretty close to a solo RPG. For example, the Dungeons and Dragons Adventure series, like Castle Ravenloft, Wrath of Ashardalon, Legacy of Drizzt. Those are really good games. They are not perfect. Perhaps sometime in the far future, probably I will review them because I really enjoy them, but I do identify some flaws. So when you have the concept, when you grasp the reality of the solo board game experience, you can see more or less how that could translate or serve as a sort of gateway to solo RPGs. The main difference with a solo board game and a solo role-playing game is that role-playing games give you a lot more freedom. In a solo board game, you are subjected to very specific rules, because that's the fun part of board games, that you can play within the rules, within the limitations, and you win the board game by a combination of luck, strategies, and tactics. But when it comes to role-playing games, the sky's the limit. It's a simulation of reality in a fictional environment. So in a board game, sometimes you can't say something like, well, I want to jump over the table and kick that plate or that cup against the enemy's face to distract him or her, and then while that enemy is like recovering from that blow, I quickly step down and slash his throat. So in a board game you cannot do that unless there are rules for that, but in a role-playing game you can always do that. Sometimes you need to make a skill check or a saving throw. Sometimes you need to roll below your attribute. Maybe it all happens automatically and you get a positive modifier or negative modifier to your attack, to your damage. It all depends on the situation, on the judgment of part of the game master. Or if you are playing solo on your own reason, the logic, the context of the situation, the space and time, all of that could result in something beneficial or negative to you. Perhaps you also want to add some elements of chance. Maybe you are making this sort of maneuver, you are playing a solo role-playing game and you are playing as a player character and you want to do this really flashy, perhaps even effective attack, but you are not too sure if it will be really such a good idea. And because you want your character to survive, you don't know if you're actually cheating by, oh yeah, well that seems like a great idea, I'm going to give myself a +2 to attack and +1 to damage. But sometimes you could be thinking, well, I'm actually cheating because I'm just doing that so my character wins the encounter easily. Maybe you can decide by making a roll, or like I said, by making a skill check, etc. So the main difference is that there are so many more options, so many more ways in which you can use spells and attacks. In board games, you have these spells in the case of fantasy games, or psionic powers in science fiction games, and they have a very specific use. They deal this damage or they paralyze the enemy, etc. But with role-playing games, maybe you want to use that magic missile, or depends on the system, right? There are many variations of magic missile. Maybe you want to use it to strike a button or a lever to activate this device, this trap, or open a door. And you cannot do that in a board game unless it is in the rules. You can come up with your own house rules for different board games, and I think that's when the board game starts to turn a bit into a role-playing game. And that's without taking into consideration some social encounters that could happen in-game that have not been programmed into the rule set of that particular board game. And the same can be said, of course, logically about computer role-playing games, choose your own path, sort of books, choose your own story. Now, some could be thinking that in the case of Deluxe, Tunnels and Trolls, there are also plenty of limitations, because each adventure module of Tunnels and Trolls, it's also in a certain way one of those choose your own path book. But that's when the rule system of Deluxe, Tunnels and Trolls comes into play. There are these ways in which you can use your skills, your abilities, to carry out all sorts of combat stunts and use your gear and items in creative ways. So you can always add some modifiers or specific situations to each encounter related to battle or to some hazard, etc., or social interaction. So there's a lot of freedom in solo role-playing games. It's also important to know if you want to play a particular session or a campaign as a solo game master or solo player character. There are actually plenty of solo players out there that do not know that you can play a solo role-playing game as a game master with this artificial intelligence controlling the player characters. Again, if you are not familiar with my method, with Abraham's method, please check out the links in the description, because with that method you create a sort of way for the player characters to respond to whatever situation you are presenting to them as a solo game master. And this is where Entropino's comment comes into play. He said, like I mentioned, that sometimes the results are quite schizophrenic, and I agree. But I also think that is in addition to that, that many players, based on the results of when I play with my group, and even in present times, they still surprise me when they come up with some action, some course of action that to me it makes no sense at all. But for them, it's that sense of freedom, and they're going to exercise that freedom to see if they can obtain some reward for it. For example, I'm going to give you this is somewhat of a funny but at the same time exasperating example. There were two player characters, and they needed to reach an adventure site. They were moving through this very difficult to traverse terrain. There were some forests, but there were also like these pits and crevices and cracks and small hills, and it wasn't easy to move through all of those places. And it served as a great excuse to present some ambushes to them. They actually had to become quite stealthy, move very carefully, so that they would get the jump on the enemies instead. But then they came upon this huge chasm. It was basically like a precipice. Like, yes, you can easily fall down and die because of that hazard. And they needed to get to the other side. So I described the scene, and they mentioned that there are a couple of bridges over there. You could take the long way around. It also looks like maybe you can ask for information to see if there is some sort of shortcut, because they had encountered a typical guy living alone in the shack in the forest, in the cabin. So I presented to them a few ways in which they could handle the situation. But then they decided to go down the cliff, the precipice. So to me it made no sense, because why would you want to go down? They couldn't even see the bottom clearly. And then they decided to go. So they started to make different checks, and we started to describe the way that they were descending. They actually suffered some wounds, not too severe, because they were quite well equipped to climb with ropes and pikes and all of that. Eventually, after a lot of time passed, they reached the bottom, and in the bottom there wasn't almost anything. There were just like a few bones. It was quite desolate. It seemed like the ground had just split open during an earthquake. So there wasn't anything down there, and they became somewhat frustrated because they thought they were going to find something there, and then they decided to climb up the other side. That's a way to do it, but they spent so much time. They spent food because it became quite late, and because they were spending so much energy climbing down and up. I said, you need to eat some rations because you're feeling a bit weak. They actually had to take a small break because it was just, the fall was tremendous. It was a huge chasm, very deep. So to me it seemed just so nonsensical, almost like a schizophrenic action, that well, there's this hole between me and my objective, I'm going to climb down the hole and I'm going to climb up, when there were bridges. They could take the other way around, which would have taken less time. The long way around was actually shorter compared to their course of action. Maybe they could have decided to purchase some magic items. They had a lot of money to get some rings or something that enabled them to fly or levitate. But they decided to do that. So players specifically, tend to surprise you with those actions that sometimes feel quite nonsensical. Now, there is what I would consider a negative tendency in current times to cuddle up or pamper players too much. Another game master would have probably said that, oh, as you went down the chasm, you see at the bottom there is this mysterious door, or there is this treasure chest, and ooh and ah, and yes, that would make for a somewhat more exciting or entertaining foray into the depths of the chasm. But to me, it feels too disconnected from a sense of logic. That is, in real life, if you decide to go down some place or go towards in a direction, it doesn't mean that there is always going to be something valuable or exciting or some adventure seed waiting for you to just to discover it. If right now I go out of my house and just keep walking west or east, and I'm going to reach a house, and that's it. That's a house. If you knock at the door, you better have a good excuse as to why you are knocking at their door. So it doesn't have to be like, oh, and suddenly you find a mysterious object in the ground, or as you are walking around, a mysterious stranger appears and mentions something cryptic. It's not always going to be like that. Not all actions should be rewarded. Otherwise, the players are always going to feel like there is something, there is a reward waiting for them at their during their any action that they take. It reminds me of a couple of strips from the comic book Knights of the Dinner Table, and in a moment I will say how that is related to solo RPGs. But well, in those comic strips of Knights of the Dinner Table, which I actually love that series, I don't remember all of the development, but in one situation, the player characters reach a dead end, and there is like this wall, and then that's it. The game master B8 tells them that it's a dead end. There is this wall, and that's it. So the player characters become obsessed, and they start to look for secret doors. They cannot find anything, neither in the wall or in the ground or the ceiling. They start to use. I think they use some sort of spell like a disbelief to. They think that it's an illusion, and they reach a point, to the point, yes, that they start to carve their way. They try to destroy the wall, and they're basically carving their way through the dungeon, wasting so much time and resources because they think that because they went into a particular direction, there has to be something of value there. The same thing in another strip. It's similar thing. They are moving through a forest, and there are this bunch of trees, and they start to move through this dense forest. And BA, well, as a game master, he starts to become very frustrated. And he starts to say, and there are more and more trees, and the forest is becoming denser. And so the player characters think that he's trying to keep them away from some sort of treasure or special adventure site or something. And they start to move through the forest, hack away at the trees, and they just keep going. And this is an example of why it's not a good idea to reward player characters no matter what action they decide to take. So how does this all relate to solo role-playing games? In the case of Abraham's method, it's directly connected to what Entropino said. Sometimes the player characters are going to take some actions that look quite crazy, quite schizophrenic, and you should consider that result as a way to hone your skills as a game master. When you are playing with your group, they are going to throw all sorts of fastballs and curveballs at you, and you need to improvise. You need to make sense of the situation, come up with some interesting results that at the same time make sense and are logical with what has been going on with the adventure and the purpose of the adventure side, the dungeon, the labyrinth, the mansion, or if they are moving outdoors, how it is related to those ruins, to those mountains or caverns. So it's a great way to engage in that practice of becoming a better game master by handling whatever crazy result you obtain by using Abraham's method. So your character suddenly decided to go running in that direction, or to tinker or fool around with this device. Let it happen. Now, going back to beginner tips for solo RPGs, you need to think if your solo RPG session or campaign is actually entertaining for you. Let's say that you decided to start with Scarlet Heroes, and you don't like the way that the system handles city adventures. For those of you that haven't played Scarlet Heroes, there is a sort of race against time. When you are moving in the city, you are gathering clues and such to figure out some sort of the truth behind a mystery or an issue. But some people could be thinking, well, that feels a bit too limiting, to like it puts constraints or sometimes some type, sorry, of situational or time-related limitations that I do not like. Just eliminate that subsystem of the game. If that is no longer fun for you, remove it entirely. Just remove it. And maybe you start to generate some random events in the city. Maybe it will make sense depending on the MacGuffin or anything that you generated. It depends. It depends on many things. But if you are looking for someone, for an object, if you are chasing a villain, an enemy, just make sense of how the different encounters unfold. Maybe a group or a set of encounters will eventually lead you, logically speaking, to the thing that you are searching for. If you are looking for a stolen object and you got into an encounter with a bandit, maybe you interrogate the bandit and he tells you that there is a rumor that he didn't steal the object, but there is a rumor that an auction is being carried out in some den, some shady den in the city. So now the next encounter is going to feature your character infiltrating or disguising himself or herself to get into that auction, and maybe they are auctioning the object that you are searching for. Maybe things will unfold with a huge battle scene. Maybe someone purchases that object and you try to convince that non-player character that purchased the object to sell it to you, or maybe you can obtain it in exchange for some sort of task or a quest. So it's all about thinking what is fun for you in a solo role-playing game. If you are playing a solo RPG and you feel like there's just too much bookkeeping, you could switch to a more simple system, or you can, perhaps you are controlling an entire party of adventurers, maybe just control half of them. Maybe you were playing as 4, now only control 2 player characters or just 1. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the system feels just too simple for you. Switch to a more complicated system, or come up with some house rules, some different options, strategies and tactics that you can employ. Come up with your own modifiers and rules if you think it will be more fun for you like that. That's why I recommend that you start out with Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls or Scarlet Heroes or Seekers Beyond the Shroud, because as you play those solo role-playing games, you start to come up with some ideas or notions on what you find entertaining or boring in a solo RPG. Decide if you want to change to another system or make some modifications. I was going to talk about something else right now. It was like in the tip of my tongue and I forgot about it. Yes, but that's basically it. Finding what you find entertaining in a particular role-playing game, sticking to that sense of being entertained. If it is no longer fun, if it feels like almost like just like some sort of job or boring task, like, oh no, I have to continue the solo campaign, there is something that needs to be changed. Yes, this is the point that I was going to talk about. Sometimes people, depending on the emulators that they use, when you are playing as a player character and you are using this Game Master emulator, for some people it is difficult to know when to stop the adventure or the campaign. In my opinion, it's all about making sense on how the different encounters connect with each other. As you start to encounter different enemies, hazards, adventure sites, they will all start to click. Don't worry too much about having like the beginning and the middle of the adventure and the climax and all of that. Just let it happen, unfold organically, logically. Some people refer to this as being your own game master. I remember that one of my viewers, Droid Life, mentioned that I should talk about that. I think I have talked a bit about that, although I haven't clarified that that's the concept, but I actually dislike the notion of being your own game master, because the magic for me when it comes to solo role playing games is that I get to feel as if I am actually playing with someone else. Because for many reasons, sometimes your group doesn't want to play a specific role playing game, and you feel like you have these imaginary players or imaginary game master that actually want to play that role playing game. And it feels like you're actually not playing a solo RPG. I think that's the magic of solo RPGs. It feels like you are playing with someone else. You don't feel like you are playing solo, at least not in my case. So when you mention things like you have to be your solo game master, for me it's a bit like a bummer, because I always feel like I am playing with these imaginary players or imaginary game master. And the thing that helps support that magic is related to Entropino's comment. The schizophrenic decisions of the players or the non-player characters, depending if you are using the different systems that I have talked about in Abraham's method to determine the behavior of player characters, if you are playing as a solo game master, or maybe you are playing as a player character and you are determining the actions of the non-player characters using that artificial intelligence system, then it feels like the game is coming alive. You don't know what to expect of the other imaginary person or persons at the table. So yes, I hope these tips and advice were helpful for those that are trying to get started with solo role playing games, and for those of you that are veterans to solo RPGs, I hope that you will find this video entertaining, perhaps informative in some aspects. I will also recommend that those of you that are getting started with solo RPGs, try other Game Master emulators. The typical go-to Game Master emulator, because I think it was the first one, Mythic, the Mythic Game Master emulator. It's such a popular choice, right? But there are also plenty others lately. In the case of, if you want more structure, if you want to determine the beginning, middle, and end, there is the Conjectural Game Master emulator. I think that's the correct name. Either way, I'm going to put the link in the description. That's a great choice if you want a more structured way on how to determine when the adventure is going to end or when you are going to reach a conclusion. And if you want an even more simple Game Master emulator, it's one of the best Game Master emulators that I have seen. Please check out my video on the TriCube's system emulator. TriCube Tales, I think it was called. Either way, it's the link will be in the description. So thank you for watching this video, and thank you Juliet and Entropino for your comments. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending drive-thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.